So today I'm going to talk about the production of eelgrass sod for the restoration of lake systems. So first, let's talk a little bit about our waters and what grows in our waters. Florida's waters are multi-use, so we use them for lots of things. Our human uses include, they're our source of irrigation water for our crops. They're our drinking water. Recreation as well, of course. Hunting, boating, fishing, swimming, jet skiing. But Mother Nature uses our waters as well. These are the habitat for our aquatic fauna. So they're really important. And the waters are important, but the things that grow in the water are important as well. So aquatic plants provide food, habitat, refuge for our aquatic critters. And in South Florida, aquatic plants cause lots of problems in our flood control canals. They clog them up, and we have to do a lot of control efforts, but that's a whole different talk. So we're going to focus on water as habitat for aquatic critters. Most of our waters already have a substantial number of aquatic plants, combinations of submersed, emergent, and floating plants. But some of our systems are just totally devoid of aquatic vegetation, so they're poor habitat for our aquatic animals. And that's where I come in. Oh yeah, there's nice flamingos down at the STAs in West Palm Beach. So this is a project that I undertook with the support of FWC, and this is through the Aquatic Habitat Restoration and Enhancement Subdivision. And they like using native plants, go figure, in aquatic systems as a habitat improvement method. So with this project, we started out by working with eelgrass, which is Vallisneria americana. One of the great things about this particular species is it's a native, first of all, which is critically important for habitat restoration. We don't like using introduced species. So eelgrass is a native plant. It also reproduces primarily by vegetative means. So we start with one plant here, and it makes baby plants, just like a spider plant that you see at Home Depot that they sell in the hanging baskets. So these spread by vegetative means. This is really great in aquatic systems because if you put in just a few plants, they will spread on their own and make new plants and form a big population. What we've found in earlier research is that there are a number of different ecotypes or forms of eelgrass, and there's the requisite $20 DNA shot. So this is actually just a picture of each of these lanes represents a different ecotype of eelgrass, and the ecotypes are associated with one particular ecosystem. So the plants that we have in Lake Harney are our Lake Harney ecotypes. The plants from Lake Apopka are Lake Apopka ecotypes, and so on. We found that they're genetically distinct from one another, but they also have very different cultural requirements, and that can be important. As a species, eelgrass tends to prefer really sort of sandy habitat, sandy sediments, nutrient-poor environments. A lot of the systems that we want to restore are not like that at all. They tend to be very mucky. They tend to be very nutrient-rich and loaded with organic matter. So as part of this project, we wanted to identify ecotypes from various lakes throughout Florida that were adapted to those mucky, nutrient-rich conditions. And from screening the ecotypes, we found that each of these ecotypes has different sediment requirements or tolerances. And we'll talk more about that momentarily. So for this project, actually for restoration projects, the source material can come from a number of different places. Nursery plants are sometimes used in restoration projects. But there are problems associated with nursery-grown plants. One of those is getting enough plant material. So if you need to put out 100,000 eelgrass plants into a system, very few nurseries will have that much plant material on hand. So that can be a challenge associated with nursery-grown plants. And also, when you're buying large volumes like that of plants, it can get expensive. So a lot of time, restoration managers actually field collect the material that they're going to take to a new system. So this is a field collected guy here, and you can see that that vegetative spread, the production of those rhizomes. But field collection of these plants has its own set of challenges. First of all, we're taking plants out of an existing population, so we're depleting that population. When we pull them out of that system, we damage the roots because you're ripping them out of their home, basically. So you tend to lose a lot of the root material. And then you take them to a new system and you're putting them into soft sediment with these damaged roots. And what happens a lot of the time is as soon as they put one of those plants in that soft flocculent sediment, they turn their back and go to the next plant, and the one they just planted has popped and it's floating on the surface of the water and it's gone. So it's kind of a challenge. And that's where the transplanting part comes in. If we're doing individual plants, putting out 100,000 plants individually underwater is expensive. That requires a lot of people. It requires a lot of bending over. So people with backs that are much better than mine have to do that sort of thing. Because again, these are submersed plants. They grow in a few feet of water. And they're not stable when they're planted individually because those root systems are damaged. They're going into that soft sediment. So this is one of the biggest challenges associated with using submersed plants in restoration projects. So FWC got in touch with me and said, can we come up with something that's similar to turfgrass sod? So we said, we'll try. We started out looking at a couple different types of material. For our different types of matrix that we looked at, we started with a burlap, which is just cotton fiber, just what it sounds like. We bought this at a local fabric store. And coir. Coir is actually a coconut fiber material. So this material keeps coconut fiber waste out of the waste stream. So it keeps it from being landfilled. It's a biodegradable, renewable resource, and it is actually used quite a bit for erosion control along the banks of canals and streams, but we sort of repurposed it because we're going to use this as a base for sod. Initially, we looked at 2 commercial ecotypes of eelgrass, and they're commercial because I bought them from a nursery in Lake City because we had to start somewhere. And just as a way of kind of keeping them separate, we called them wide and narrow because clearly we've got a wide-leaved plant here and a narrow-leaved plant here. They're both eelgrass, they're both Vallisneria americana, but we wanted to see how these performed in these matrices or matrices. And we wanted to see if we could use them in restoration, if one was preferable to the other. So to start this out, we planted plants on 6-inch centers. So that's what's going on here. We've got a group of these happen to be the narrow plants. And we started out with fairly small mats. We started out with 1 foot by 2 foot pieces of either burlap or the coir and planted the plants on 6-inch centers. So each of these 2 square foot pieces had 8 plants initially. And that's what they look like after they're planted. And I do want to point out the brick. These are negatively buoyant, meaning they float. So we weighted these down in the greenhouse, and after we had our 8 plants in each piece of material, we grew them out for about 8 weeks, and then we evaluated the number of plants and looked at the stability of our matrix material. So what we found is that statistically, there was no difference between the 2 types of matrix. So we had around 100 to 110 plants in each type of matrix. And we found that statistically, no difference between the ecotypes. So we had between 100 and 113 plants in each of those mats after 6 weeks or 8 weeks of culture, regardless of the ecotype. So who's heard the Mark Twain quote about statistics? I know a couple of you have because you're laughing. There are 3 types of lies. Lies, damn lies, and statistics. Yeah, the statistics are not telling the whole story on this. Normally in research, if we find no statistical difference between things, we sort of kind of toss up our hands and walk away and get on with our lives and move on to something else. But the statistics are not telling the whole story on this. And the rest of that story is, even though there was no statistical difference between those 2 types of matrix, we found that that burlap material was incredibly unstable, and the coconut fiber, or coir, was extremely stable. So this is one of those mats, and again, this is after 8 weeks of culture. So this is our green side up, plants on the top, roots on the bottom. And I don't have a picture of the plants in burlap because they fell apart as soon as I tried to take them out of the tank. So that doesn't bode well for trying to transport those to the field. So even though there was no statistical difference, the coir material was clearly a superior matrix for this. As far as the ecotypes, we found that there was a different establishment location of those ecotypes. So on our narrow biotype or ecotype, we had around 100 plants per mat. The vast majority of those were actually incorporated into the matrix. So the roots became incorporated in the coconut fiber and sort of infiltrated it, and the plants grew green side up. Whereas on our wide biotype or ecotype, the majority of the new plants that formed were either underneath that matrix, so they were underside the mat, or they rooted in the sediment. We were growing these on beds of sand. They rooted in the sediment underneath the mat. So that's not good. We want to plant this stuff just like sod. We want green side up. So when we get new plants forming underneath those mats, it's not a good thing. We want them on the tops of the mats with their roots incorporated in the mats. So based on those results, from this experiment, we found that the best of those two ecotypes was the narrow, and we found that the best of the two matrix was the coir. So at that point, we decided to scale things up and go to the field with it because we wanted to sort of get a proof of concept or ground truth these results. So we grew a bunch more of this sod in the greenhouse, and this is what one of the mats looks like when it's nice and well vegetated. We grew these for 3 to 4 months in the greenhouse, and then we took them to the field. So this was my former biologist who's since left and gone to become a police officer. He had a very intimate involvement with this research, so he was instrumental. But he's getting ready to package some of the sod that we've just taken out of a tank. So we've got green side up here, root side here. So we wrap these in plastic wrapped boxes, and you can stack these just like they stack sod. It's kind of heavy, but so is regular sod. But they transport quite well. I mean, they can stay out of the water for 3 or 4 days as long as you just keep them wrapped in plastic and make sure they're not, you don't park the truck in full sun when you've got this in the truck, because it'll cook them. And initially, we wanted to try to use these biodegradable stakes. So these are made from a corn-based material, and they break down pretty quickly over time. But these points are really dull. That coconut fiber is really tough. So we bought a couple boxes of these, and we were all excited, and then we tried to get them to go through the coir, and it just didn't happen. We would have had to get out a leather punch and punch holes in that coconut fiber to get those spikes through. So at that point, we actually changed to an 8-inch metal spike, which worked pretty well as far as getting through the coir in the field. But what we found is that if there's any current, it will actually rip the coir material out from under those metal spikes. So we had that happen the first time we put this in the field. So we had to go back the next day and actually top dress those pieces of coir with pea gravel to hold it down. Once we managed to get it to stay in place, we were good. Those plants established, they spread from that initial piece of coir that we put out there, and they fully vegetated the site where we planted them. And when we plant these in the field, we have to use exclosures because a lot of the lakes we work in are close to devoid of vegetation. So when you put nice, succulent, green plants out there, it's like opening a salad bar. My FWC guys are nodding. Everything eats eelgrass, turtles, fish, snails. So we put exclosures at all of these sites, and the nice thing is our eelgrass has spread to fill those exclosures. So it's done really great getting established at those sites. Since those small pieces worked so well, we decided to scale things up and see if we could use larger material because, 2 square feet at a time is pretty good for putting out submersed plants, but we wanted to see if we could go bigger because it is labor intensive. So we switched to a material. It's kind of hard to get an idea of scale, but there are 3 pieces in here. Each of them are 3 feet wide by 15 feet long. So we've got 3 across and 3 long. These are tanks that we built just to produce this sod in the greenhouse in Gainesville. So the tanks are 9 by 45. And we basically did the same thing that we'd done with the small pieces of coconut fiber. We plugged in our plants on 6-inch centers and grew them out for 4 or 5 months. And at the end of that 4 or 5 months, we rolled them up on metal fence posts because first of all, they're really heavy when they first come out of the tank. And second, they're extremely floppy. So we had to have something to roll them on. And after they're rolled, we would just sort of pop them at across the edge of one of these tanks and let them drain. So after about 10 minutes, they'd go from 120 pounds down to 50 or 60 pounds. Much more manageable weight. So we would roll them up. Got really great root formation, and we would always roll these so they were green side in. That's for a couple reasons. It protects the crowns of the plants, which are really sensitive to desiccation or drying out, and also because when we go to the field, this way it's easy to just unroll them and they're ready to plant. In this particular project, we were using a couple different ecotypes. So these are actually color-coded, although you can't really tell. We used flagging tape to color-code our ecotypes. But there's Ed Hayes from FWC, and he's tying one of these rolls. The rolls then got bagged like so. So these are just regular garbage bags, just extremely large. And we would bag these rolls from both ends just to make sure that we had a really good amount of coverage on these because we didn't want them to dry out. Loaded them into a truck, took them to the field. And, one he-man could probably carry these, but, none of us are all that young, so we usually transport this with 2 people, 1 on each end, holding onto that metal fence post. Whoops. And we get them loaded up into a boat. And we use fairly small boats, so it's not like you'd want to put 40 or 50 rolls of this in a boat. It's better to have multiple boats and transport them out to the planting site that way. Once you get to the planting site, they're really easy to get to the exact spot where you want to transplant them because they float along the surface of the water. So you sort of float them over to where you want to plant them. And here they are unrolling that mat. So again, this is 45 square feet. And at this point, it's got about 5,000 plants in it from an initial 150 or so. And to resolve our stability issue that we had with the smaller pieces, we actually custom fabricated these giant landscape staples. So they're sort of similar to the 8-inch ones you can buy at Lowe's or Home Depot to hold down landscape fabric, except these are made out of rebar. They have a 3-foot span, and that's so they can span the 3-foot wide mat. And they have 1-foot long legs. And so they spike down into that soft sediment really nicely, and they hold the mats down really, really well. And we use 3 of those for each of these mats, 1 in the center and 1 at each end. And using this technique, we can put 5,000 plants underwater in a minute and a half and have them secured and walk away. And we've had good success using this material as well. So it's expanded beyond the original planting site, and it's filled the exclosure where we have it planted. Aren't those pretty? I love Val. It's a nice plant. But it creates great habitat for fish and other wildlife. So the lessons learned in this project are that ecotype definitely matters. We saw that with that first experiment I talked about, with them establishing in different places. We've also found that with later research we've done. We've put a total of probably 6 different ecotypes in coconut fiber at this point with varying degrees of success. That narrow one that we started with always does well. We have some from other lakes. We've got some Lake Harney ecotypes that we've put in sod, and they do pretty well. but they seem to do a lot more vegetative growth as opposed to spreading. So we've got bigger plants but fewer. And so we've found differences like that with all the ecotypes we've tested. So doing ecotype testing small scale in this coconut material is really important before you try to go out and produce 1/10 of an acre of this sod to put in the field, because it may or may not work. Another thing we've learned is that even a slow current causes huge problems for stability. When we first put out those small 1 foot by 2 foot pieces, it didn't feel like there was any current. You know, we're standing there and, you know, maybe we'd have a little bit of drift of, you know, leaves and water hyacinths and various things going by, but it was not a strong current at all. But I'm sure you guys know this, once you get down below the water, even in shallow water, if the top feels still, that's not necessarily what's going down below. So even a little bit of current can be enough to affect your stability, unless you're using something like those rebar landscape staples to hold the coconut fiber down. And predation continues to be a problem. I've said a couple times that our plants are filling the exclosures. The exclosures are still there. We have plants we put out 4 years ago, and we have not removed the exclosures from those sites because the plants grow over to the edge of the exclosure and get grazed back. So we're kind of scared to take those exclosures out because, you know, we put a lot of effort into getting these plants to establish, and the critters are just grazing them down at the edges of those exclosures. And there might come a time in the future where we're willing to take those exclosures down because the populations are really well established at this point, but it's risky. You know, we're afraid of losing these populations, especially at some of our sewers like Lake Jesup. So at some point, the exclosures may come down, but predation is always going to be a problem when you're putting a submersed plant into a system that has very little vegetation, because critters just eat it. And the newest fly in the ointment. I've talked to a couple of you folks here about this. Some of my buddies have heard about this. In the past, we've been doing this sort of work for probably 5 or 6 years at this point. And, you know, there's normally a pretty simple protocol we follow. You know, my FWC guys get in touch with me and say, can you grow this? You know, this is when we want to go to the field with it. Sure, no problem. I grow the plants. About a month before we're ready to go to field, they pull the permits to put up the exclosures to protect the planting site. Well, this year's a little bit different. This year, my guy went to pull his permits from the Corps of Engineers, and they said, you need a dredge and fill permit. What? We're not dredging anything. We're not filling anything. This coconut fiber, by the time it goes to the field, is about a 1/2 inch thick. So we're not substantially changing the topography of that system. But the Army Corps of Engineers at this point is pretty adamant that we have to pull dredge and fill permits, which extends our planting window out about 6 months, which is a problem. Some of the sod that I have in culture right now is destined for Lake Apopka. It was supposed to go to the field last month, but the permits couldn't get pulled, and it could be December. I'm not putting anything in Apopka in December. These plants are evergreen and they're perennial, but they slow down during the winter. And so they're not going to be in a position to get really well established into that soft sediment. So basically, I'm going to have to carry these plants through winter. I can live with that. The question is, can the plants live with it? They're great in culture for 6 months, 7 months. I've carried them for a year when I've had to, but this stuff biodegrades. The coconut fiber falls apart. That's why we use it. So our big issue right now is finding out if we actually need a dredge and fill permit to put these plants out in the lake. So if you know anybody in the Army Corps of Engineers, please bend their ears and tell them we're trying to do a good thing here. As far as funding and help on this project, my FWC guys were instrumental. I don't have Bill Coleman's name on here, but Bill was definitely a part of this. Ed Hayes, Beecham, Mike, and Bruce Jagger were all instrumental with this project. And my folks up at the Center for Aquatic and Invasive Plants, Bill Haller, of course, has been a great help. Jeremy was my he-man. Kyle was another he-man. They've both since left, as have Margaret and Casey. But all of those people were critical to the success of this project because there are a lot of moving parts. So we had a lot of various people working on it, and they really helped us out a lot.